Thank you very much, Yasser, and bonjour à tous. Good morning to everybody. And I also like to thank Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada for the invitation to speak in this plenary. We're focusing on non-state actors and the migration industry, and the organization actually that I work for, as I'm sure a number of you are aware, has, in addition to governments, has non-state actors as an integral part of its governance structures, so representatives of the private sector, employers and workers. And as Yasser said, I will focus on the risks that migrants face in the recruitment process, as well as the challenges which are faced by all the relevant stakeholders in that process, including non-state actors. So I just want to put the issue of recruitment, and the focus will be on fair recruitment, into context. Now, many of you are, of course, aware of the global figures, for international migrants, 258 million, and almost half of those are women. You may be less aware that, and as has already been referred to during the context of, during the course of the conference, that the majority of these seek employment. So ILO estimates there are 164 million migrant workers. And here the proportion of women to men is a little different. Now, when it comes to matching workers abroad to jobs in destination countries, increasingly today it's the private sector that plays that matching role. So what we have seen over the last few years has been essentially an explosion of private recruiters worldwide, and we estimate that there are around 260,000. That doesn't, of course, mean that all migrants are matched to jobs by private actors. There are also public employment services that operate in this area, but the majority of them are matched in that way. In addition, these actors are important. In fact, when ILO started working in this area many years ago, originally the focus was on essentially getting rid of these actors and focusing on public-to-public recruitment. But with time that became impossible, and it was also understood that these private employment agencies play an important role in the labor market by matching effectively labor supply and demand. However, on the other hand, there are many also bad actors operating in this area, and it is the low-skilled migrants that are subject to particular risks in the recruitment process. Not just migrants, but also nationals, particularly those that are recruited within large countries like India and China, for example. And that this industry racks up a very high illegal profits. And we've estimated that there are up to 10 billion US dollars in illegal recruitment fees, which are collected from migrant workers every year. So why does fair recruitment matter? Well, it matters because, and I'll go into a little bit more on this when we discuss solutions, because it actually limits the positive effects of migration, increases the costs of migration. And for example, ILO has conducted research with the World Bank, conducted a number of surveys in some major recruitment corridors or migration corridors across the world, and has found, for example, that on average, workers can pay up to 10 months, and this is an average, of a worker's salary, of their salary in recruitment fees and related costs in certain migration corridors. And one of the most significant corridors in this context is from South Asia to the Middle East, and specifically the Gulf. So how can we talk about the promise of migration, which is of course the title of this conference, if migrants can spend up to 10 months and in some cases a lot longer in paying off debts before they can even begin to think about sending money back home, for example, to support their families? So it does matter. It also matters because of the risks of trafficking in forced labor associated with this. I'll mention a little bit more about this in a moment. And also it matters because bad matching of workers to jobs often leads to underutilization of skills, often referred to as brain waste. So what are the challenges? Well, in terms of also the risks, when it comes to workers, there are a number of risks. And some of these are essentially indicate forced labor, particularly when there's threats, abuse and violence involved, deception with regard to employment contracts, as well as restriction on freedom of movement, and particularly here the retention of passports. So it matters, of course, for workers. It also matters for governments who regulate, and here, even though there are regulatory frameworks in place, in many countries, enforcement is still very weak, particularly in the region that I work in the Middle East, for example. Often there is simply insufficient capacity or insufficient insufficient attention given to increasing capacity in this area. Governments also have difficulties in regulating recruitments in the context of concluding bilateral arrangements. Often the issue of recruitment is not raised in those arrangements, so the agreements are sometimes silent with regard to the issue of recruitment. It also matters for employers. It's important here to underscore that we often, when we talk about the costs of migration and recruitment, the focus tends to be on the workers, but the costs can also be high on employers. And when the costs are high on employers, particularly in the region that I work in, where, as we heard yesterday, the main aspect or the main aspects of governance of migration are based on the kafala sponsorship system, then those high costs for employers translate often into, poor treatment, ill treatment of the workers. And also, employers are very interested to ensure that they have workers with the right skills and not workers who are able to pay most or afford the migration process to get those jobs. So there's a clear mismatch here. And there are also key challenges for recruitment agencies. In those cases where there is a lack of appropriate regulation, this can create commercial uncertainty. Where certain actors can get away with corrupt practices, this creates an unlevel playing field for business. But also it has to be remembered that where there's over-complex regulation, this can also have a negative effect. So, in a nutshell, this is the area that is important in terms of when it comes to recruitment. It's important to reduce the costs of migration, and recruitment is a very important part of that. And it matters for all those involved in the process. And I look forward to talking about some of the solutions that we're working on in the next section of the discussion.